Welcome to the Markets Happy Hour podcast, a weekly markets update for investors the world over. Each week we discuss inflation, geopolitics, interest rates, equity markets, and other asset classes. To try to answer the question, what does this mean for my investment portfolio? Let's dive in.
As usual, we will speak about inflation, interest rates, geopolitics, equity markets, and other asset classes. And some of the subtopics for this week are inflation taking a little bit of a surprising turn to the negative in the case of the month of June, of course, backward looking, and it will have been distorted again by the oil price rises in July, but enough of an indicator that maybe the Fed can think about relaxing its no rate drop policy. The chairman of the Fed, Kevin Warsh, is not taking a victory lap. We've seen his congressional testimony, his comments on the inflation situation, and we can look at where we go from here. When it comes to the budget idea that I've expressed earlier, we will look at how companies are making ends meet and where they are taking the expenditure from in order to cover their new expenditure on AI. We're going to look at another form of rotation, which has captured the headlines this week within equity markets, and this may in fact surprise you. Looking at inflation expectations, so the headline on the right, inflation expectations on the rise, says the Fed, that actually is a headline from last week. So just the way we are seeing these real completely polar opposite points of view on inflation is just how difficult it is to really read numbers at this point. If we look at this Bloomberg chart suggesting how the inflation cookie crumbled, we can see that although energy was still a large percentage of the price hike, it is falling, at least it was in June. This may now have changed again when it comes to July. Food has been fairly stable and core services remain also fairly stable. That is the one to watch. That's the bit that is somewhat difficult to erase from inflation in the last mile. If we look here at the inflation turning negative, it says big falls in oil allow very occasionally for sharp reversals in prices. As we know, there was a fairly instantaneous transmission effect of the oil price through to fuel prices. They did fall in measure and I suppose in the expectation of new ships going through the Strait of Hormuz. So there was a suggestion that the June inflation number was sufficiently soft that consumers could relax, and indeed that the Federal Reserve could relax around being super hyper focused on the inflation number. Now that we are getting a few weeks to compose a verdict on Kevin Warsh, the new chairman, we can see that there has already been a sharp fall in expected rates thanks to the low June CPI number. Expectations critical when it comes to interest rates as well as inflation, as we've noted before. And as we can see now that inflation predictions have been dipping below 2% for the first time in the second Trump term. So I should say that Kevin Warsh did hesitate before taking a victory lap, even though he may have been encouraged to do so in Congress. So clearly far too early to come up with a verdict around inflation and it being vanquished. And equally, quite difficult to predict the ultimate trajectory of rate rises here. I'd say it is interesting just to see how much the oil price, though, can really affect that top line inflation figure.